Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us for this session. My name is Rachel Korberg. I am the incoming executive director of the Families and Workers Fund. We are a new collaborative philanthropy that's been established to help address the economic impacts of COVID-19. And our goal for this time together today is to share with you what we're about, to explore the role of collaborative philanthropy during this pandemic, and to workshop our emerging strategy as we pivot from rapid response to thinking more about the next few years and how we change some of the economic and government systems that are the reason why this pandemic is also experienced as a crisis of spiking poverty and hunger, and as a crisis of equity, where we know that Black and Indigenous and Latinx and low-income people, women, caregivers are disproportionately experiencing the economic pain. It doesn't have to be that way. That's not what a pandemic has to mean. So to get into this, we have three really amazing speakers. Each of you are a North Star for me as a leader in philanthropy in different ways. Your vision and your boldness has been key to the Families and Workers Fund. It's been critical to how we've been able to work so quickly. So I'm going to invite each of you to just start by introducing yourselves, sharing your name and your institution, in addition to your role and title and focus area. And I will start by handing it to my boss and the amazing Sarita Gupta from the Ford Foundation.
Thank you, Rachel. It's so great to be here with all of you this afternoon. My name is Sarita Gupta. I'm with the Ford Foundation, and I'm the director of the Future of Workers program. The program is committed to building a future in which working people will experience basic economic security, dignity on the job, and greater opportunity for themselves and the next generation. So we believe the future is fundamentally about people. Therefore, we focus on the future of workers and how we can collectively develop a path to shared prosperity and economic security for all workers. So our work focuses on modernizing the social contract and labor policy, reimagining the flow of capital and markets, and fostering more responsible innovation and technology. Should I pass, or will you maybe I'll pass over to Betsy.
Thank you, Sarita. It's great to be here. I'm Betsy Krebs. I'm the Vice President of the Poverty Program at the JPB Foundation. For those of you who don't know, JPB is a national foundation advancing opportunity in the U.S. through initiatives that empower those living in poverty, that sustain and enrich our environment, and that enable pioneering medical research. I manage the Poverty Program, which is about a third of the foundation's giving, to groups focused on economic justice, health equity, and democracy. I'll just say that when COVID hit almost a year ago, JPB was particularly well positioned to quickly respond to ensure the security and health of our grantee partners and to address emergency relief needs across the country. And I think we were able to do this for two reasons. First, our grant-making areas, medical research, environment, and poverty, meant that we had the relationships with relevant leaders in place, from top medical researchers who could quickly pivot to work on a vaccine and treatment for COVID, to those organizing frontline essential workers, to groups working end-to-end evictions, those promoting access to healthcare, and more. But second, we already had a framework for responding to emergencies. While the majority of JPB's giving is through large multi-year grants, we've provided emergency relief grants since the foundation's beginning, starting with our response to Superstorm Sandy in 2012. We've continued to meet the immediate needs of communities as they are impacted by extreme weather events around the country, and this has been of great importance to our leadership, to our president, and to our board. So by the end of March, we quickly adapted our emergency relief framework to begin making COVID relief grants. Our first round of emergency relief funding by the end of May was around $40 million, and in the last 10 months, I think we've reached close to $90 million. And we were able to do that in part by collaborating with other funders. So collaboration is a core value at JPB, and we participate in a lot of pooled funds, including this one. And as a leanly staffed organization, we really appreciate the opportunity to join with others to learn how to do this better. So we're looking forward to the conversation today, how to move forward. Adelise.
Thank you, Betsy. Yeah, Adelise.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. Thanks for having me. My name is Adalise Rodriguez. I am a Senior Program Officer for the Morgan Stanley Foundation. I manage our philanthropic grants around children's health, including our partnerships with Feeding America, Kaboom, and our new Morgan Stanley Alliance for Children's Mental Health. I also manage our disaster relief efforts, and that's how I started working with this wonderful group. And then on my corporate side, on my community affairs side, I manage employee giving for the firm, as well as work on employee engagement and volunteerism. Rachel?
Thank you. And I also want to give a big thank you to our colleague, Anthony, who is projecting the slides right now. So thanks, Anthony, and you can go to the first slide. So before we get into the discussion, I just want to give a quick overview of what the Families and Workers Fund is. I always go back to this picture in March. So this is March 2020. This is when the pandemic is really setting in the US. This is a picture of a food bank in Minneapolis. It's filling with people who are likely among the 15% of the country who were unemployed at that time. So this was a moment when we knew that philanthropy was going to need to act differently and act quickly and really show up in coordinated ways together. We quickly came together, and I would say it was really spurred by our grantee partners, so who immediately were calling us in March and talking us through workers who were quickly being laid off and either not eligible for unemployment insurance or not able to access it. On the other hand, we were also hearing the stories of workers who were very much not laid off, who were essential and being called on to step up, whether in healthcare or at grocery stores, but who in many cases really feared for their lives and were struggling to get access to things like paid sick days and the types of workplace health and safety practices that really made them feel safe and like they could go home to their families. So knowing that there are these two really different realities that struggling workers and families are feeling in this moment, we decided to come together and pool resources so that we could really surge in the way that we knew many of our grantee partners were ready to do. So next slide, please. So this is Families and Workers Fund, just some quick information. Right now, we're about a $33 million fund. In 2020, we were able to raise a bit less than that. So we did about $9 million in surge funding. Some of our impacts, we focused a lot on direct relief initially, and specifically providing grants to organizations that were already in really trusted, authentic, long-term relationships with workers who were struggling the most. So maybe that was immigrant day laborers or care workers or workers in the gig economy. Our rapid funding directly supported 15,000 struggling workers and families and provided support to organizations to do this for another 200,000. Our grantees also helped to do a rollout, an equitable and effective rollout of the first federal paid sick days policy. We can have the best policies on the books, but it really matters in how they're implemented. And then a number of the fund grantee partners played a critical role in ultimately making the case for expanded unemployment insurance. The majority of our grants were focused on people who are excluded from the benefit system or were the hardest hit. And one of the things that's most exciting to us about the fund is that we have 18 very diverse funders all around the table pooling resources. So we have tech funders, Schmidt Futures, we have corporate partners like Morgan Stanley, and we have a number of private foundations like JPB and the Ford Foundation, as well as some individuals and family offices. What's exciting is that many of these funders have actually not worked together before, and this fund is one of the first ways that we're all coming together. So that will take me to our first question for our speakers. So, Sarita, why was a pooled fund, in your view, needed and part of the way that philanthropy addresses the economic impacts of COVID-19? What was Ford specifically hoping to achieve?
Yeah, first of all, Rachel, I really appreciated that slide, that picture of the food bank. Because in spring of 2020, it was really clear that there was a level of coordination that was taking hold around the public health crisis, but there wasn't an equivalent sort of coordination around the needs of our economy, and with a focus specifically on struggling workers. So I was personally inundated with calls of funders who were new to these issues or wanting to strategize about what to do, and calls from amazing organizations ready to surge but in need of support. So the idea of the Families and Workers Fund is to be able to help philanthropy surge and meet this moment when 10 million people have lost their jobs since March of 2020, and many more are underemployed. For those who are still in work, such as essential workers, many are fearful of getting sick on the job and need better workplace safety, benefits, and pay. This pandemic has laid bare the results of decades of growing inequality and compounded it, taking a disproportionate toll on the poor, people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, and others who were already marginalized before the crisis. And when we talk about low-income workers who are disproportionately BIPOC and women, they weren't in great shape before the pandemic. We had already seen 40 years of stagnant pay and huge barriers to worker voice. Even before this economic recession hit, 12 million adults who were employed full-time lived at or as much as 200% below the federal poverty line. So the pandemic has hit people in communities who are already made vulnerable. But in moments of crisis, they're also lined with enormous opportunities. And so as a foundation that is committed to combating inequality, we are committed to supporting partners and working with others in philanthropy to ensure an equitable economic recovery. So I'm excited about the fund because it's about working as a collective. The whole of our parts is greater than the sum. For example, we have funders who are brilliant at delivery and technology systems, and then also funders who are deeply rooted in social movements and social justice. And what we've witnessed and seen through this collaboration is that we need both equity and efficiency to really deliver recovery that uplifts all of us. And so that's really the story behind why we felt it was so important to pull this fund together.
So much, Sarita. One of the key parts of the fund that you've touched on was direct relief, in particular, direct relief to people who were either intentionally excluded from our social safety net and benefit systems, or those who were especially hard hit. That was a key part of our work last year. And Betsy, I know at JPB, that was a key role that you played and a key focus within the fund. So could you talk to us a little bit about the focus on direct relief and where you think that that work needs to go for philanthropy?
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm building on what you both said. Yes, we were interested in this fund in particular as an emergency relief grant because of the direct relief component. We support a lot of the organizations kind of in the economic justice, immigrants, workers world already. And we were looking for how we could continue to get more money directly to people left out of social safety net and benefits programs. So, and again, I also appreciate the sort of look back to last March, because it feels like so much has happened since then. When we first learned that the virus was sickening and killing people, overwhelming our hospitals and healthcare systems and workers. And every day we were hearing announcements of different parts of the economy literally shutting down. One day restaurants, then museums, movie theaters, travel, schools. At the same time, we were all moving to, many of us who had the luxury to move to remote work from home. We were recognizing that this was a luxury, that millions were suddenly out of work, and millions more were at risk through their work taking care of our health, getting us food, caring for our kids and our older relatives too. So, we knew that foundations can't solve problems of this magnitude by any chance, that we need government to step in. But there are inherent limitations in that as far as the speed at which government can move and getting the relief to the people who most need it. So as I said before, JPB, we really prioritize our COVID emergency relief grant making to save lives, limit economic harm, and to sustain the nonprofit sector. So when we were thinking about what to do, we were funding the medical community to accelerate scientific research to prevent and treat COVID. We gave additional funds to our own grantees for their needs. And we funded dozens of groups to pass through money to communities and frontline workers for housing, food, internet access, other needs that they had, including, sadly, burial expenses for those who died from COVID. We were also looking to join with other foundations and pooled funds to make sure that philanthropic dollars were going to the people most in need. So it was not a hard decision when Sarita approached us in April and said, do you want to join this new initiative? Because we were already aligned on the goals, I think. And we immediately agreed because we saw that this could provide a lifeline to thousands of people most at risk. And these were the people, as you said, who were deemed essential, but didn't have paid sick leave, didn't have the ability to work remotely, healthcare, financial security. And I think we were really thinking about those who were the immigrant low-wage workers in particular, for example, farm workers who've been especially vulnerable to COVID due to overcrowded housing and transportation conditions, the designation of agriculture as an essential industry during the pandemic, and the near total lack of access to medical care and other assistance even before COVID hit. So when we made our first wave of direct relief funding through this fund, I think we were focused really on the national organizations supporting families and workers in these most impacted industries, including hospitality, farming, and the care industry. So we funded, I recall, the collaboration with the farm worker organizers in Florida and Partners in Health and the community organization to really make sure that we were getting direct relief to farm workers in Florida, distributing food and cash to those workers. We also were supporting groups like National Domestic Workers Alliance to get emergency financial relief to nannies, house cleaners, home care workers, many of whom lost their jobs immediately in March, and millions of others who were taking on new dangerous work because of COVID. So our NDWA, I know, raised enough money to help, I think, 50,000 workers eventually with 2 rounds of cash payments. And you know, during the later waves of grant making, I know we were bolstering the efforts of national worker-led organizations, providing assistance in high-need sectors, hospitality, restaurants, and regionally focused groups also in Puerto Rico and other places that were badly hit where there were rising COVID cases and increased financial need. So one of the groups that I know we were recommending was the National Day Labor Organizer Network, NDLON, which through worker centers and day labor corners around the country, were making sure that financial support really went directly into the hands of day laborers and low-wage workers. And I think in addition to offering financial assistance, they were organizing food banks, manufacturing masks, really making sure that people had what they needed as they continued to risk their lives daily, many of them. And when the $600 a week unemployment benefit ended in the end of July, the fund continued with a smaller round of funding to address urgent needs, again, especially focusing on the BIPOC communities that we're most concerned about. I think what JPB, our approach, and I hope what we brought to the fund was this sort of framework about emergency relief grant making. Because we did, although our typical grants are, long investments in larger organizations, in emergency relief work, we really have this focus on always trusting the organizations and leaders to know what they need and respecting their solutions for their needs. So, we tend to get recommendations from the grantees themselves, from our program officers. At JPB, we bring them directly to the president, our recommendations, and we're lucky to have a very active, involved president who will immediately sort of approve things or not, and then we will just move right along to inviting an application. And our emergency relief applications are very short. We don't even ask for a budget, and they're approved quickly, and we get the money out as fast as we can. So we really try to keep an emphasis on swift, direct aid. And I think that this fund was really able to embody that in many ways as well. So I think going forward, we need to keep focusing on meeting direct needs as well as ensuring that we have a just recovery. I mean, there's a great window of opportunity in some ways now to have some of these changes that have come about in the past year at the government level to make sure that they stick and, as you said, are implemented well. And so I think we have a lot of opportunity to go forward from here.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Annalise, I'm going to turn to you. We've talked now about Ford Foundation, a legacy foundation, JPB, which has, a living and engaged founder. And you're really here speaking also from the corporate philanthropy lens. So it would be great to hear more about what you see as the role for corporate philanthropy from a sort of crisis response perspective, but also as we look to the next few years of the recovery period.
So I think, when I introduced myself, I sort of described what my role is. And as corporate philanthropists, we tend to be generalists. So we may have a particular focus area in giving, for Morgan Stanley is children's health. Those are my primary grantees. But I also manage employee giving and volunteerism. So we don't necessarily have the insight into particular focus areas. When COVID hit, we were tasked with developing a global program and distribution process for our funding. And we knew right away that we should be fighting the virus and supporting healthcare workers. But we knew that it was really important to support workers that were affected by the economic fallout. And that is not one of our expertise. So when we heard about the fund, we were immediately interested. We knew from the diversity of grant makers that they were bringing their expertise and their insights, that they were familiar with the charities that we were funding or interested in funding. We knew that the aid was going to be distributed immediately, which was really important to us, as well as the fund really made an effort to make sure that the funding was spread out across the United States. So for us, making sure that it wasn't just in New York City. We really felt like the pulling together of resources and the knowledge that all of the grant makers were bringing together was the most important thing. Actually, Rachel, I'm sorry, I know you asked a second question regarding corporate philanthropy overall. So I did want to talk a little bit about that. I think that, as we look forward, corporate philanthropists can think about having a COVID lens in some of their grant making. I think a lot of us will probably go back to our usual grant making and sticking to our regular budgets that are not necessarily COVID specific, but we can apply a COVID lens to the work that we're doing. And I know for us at Morgan Stanley, last year we launched our Alliance for Children's Mental Health. That was pre-COVID. And now going forward into this year, we're really going to focus about how are we helping kids now that they're going to be going back into the classroom. If any of these children who had mental health issues that were exacerbated by being at home for so long, how do we support them? So just sort of applying that COVID lens, I think is going to be really important whenever possible. We also really want to be flexible with our grantees if they are looking at ways that changing programming or grants that we have already approved, but they feel that changing some of those or loosening restrictions or changing some of the programs in order to better meet COVID needs, for example, with our food banks, we're very open to doing that. I think the other thing that I would say for corporate philanthropists is that we really can use our networks and sort of being connectors. I know for us, we've made a really big effort of talking up the fund to our counterparts at other firms and making sure that they know about the work that is being done and how helpful it is for workers all over the country. I think that we also really can amplify the message. We have a very great communications platform, and we're really able to make sure that we're talking to our employees and our clients about the work that the fund is doing. That's it. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks so much. That was great. And I really appreciate, it should just be a given for every funder, but I don't know that it always is. Like, we need to be maximum flexible. It's not about reporting deadlines. It's not about trying to hold people to a project grant proposal. Like, to your point too, Betsy, provide the resources, trust the leaders, and get out of the way, and provide whatever additional support and championing is needed. So I really appreciate the way that the three of you embody that and have enabled the fund to really embody and try to practice those values as well. So I want to pivot here because one of our interests in having this session and why we were excited to partner with the Yale Philanthropy Conference was to share some of our emerging strategy about where the fund is going. Both to invite each of you to share some reflections, but also to invite people to really engage in the chat, which we'll get to, and share questions and also suggestions. So knowing that the first not even quite year of this fund now, focused on this rapid response, both the direct cash relief and laying some of the basic groundwork for policy that was going to be necessary in the recovery, paid sick days, unemployment insurance, et cetera. You know, we now are pivoting to thinking about what the next few years look like. I think there's an interest among all of the funders in really thinking about the systems that put us in this place in the first place. So there's two areas that we're coalescing around. A lot of this comes from what we're learning from grantee partners and from worker leaders who have been part of really shaping the fund's priorities. So the first is around our benefit system. So, you know, we all agree that the worst moment in your life when you lose a job, that should not define your future. Yet the way it's currently set up, losing a job can turn into a winter without heat or can turn into an eviction. So what would it look like to actually do some really dedicated, deeper funding around unemployment insurance in particular? There's a real opening in this moment. And then the second area we've been calling Recover Up. As Sarita said so clearly, it's not like things were going really well for people in low-income jobs before the pandemic. So how can we use this momentum of the recovery to really fuel not only job growth, because it's not only about quantity, but about really high quality jobs that provide opportunity, mobility, career advancement, and dignity for workers. So knowing that we're thinking about these two areas, I want to invite each of our speakers to just share some reflections on where this strategy is going and takeaways from how our work to date is influencing this. Would anyone like to kick us off?
Kicked us off last time. So Betsy or Annalise, go for it.
I could start, I think, because for us, you know, we're definitely still involved in the fund and will continue obviously to be a part of it. But because our focus area is really in providing the direct relief, this is the moment where we sort of step back and let the other funders sort of lead with their expertise. You know, advocacy is not one of our pillars in our philanthropic efforts, but we know it is very important. So this is an area where we will definitely allow the other funders to step up, and we're supportive.
Yeah, we're thinking about these issues in a related way. So, I mean, it feels like that in the last year, the groups and the strategies are coming together in new ways in the social justice field. So, for example, across the care industry, there's like a real sort of feeling of movement around different types of care jobs and paid family leave and benefits, and people thinking about childcare and home care and healthcare, all sort of in a more unified way. And I think also in the immigrant justice world too, there's a real alignment around the organizations that are working together across strategies, and a sort of sense that there's a range of things that can be possible from the federal government, and that we need to align on funders and groups on those issues, and also not let up the pressure. I think also just because we have this moment when people were like, oh, we should get cash to, families that have children to cut child poverty. That's great. Let's really push on that now. So I think there's a lot of things that are sort of in the conversation now that we have the opportunity to further and both make sure that they're implemented and to continue pushing for bolder choices.
Yeah, I would just add, because everything that Annalise and Betsy have said really resonates. At Ford, we've been thinking a lot about the work through the lens of response, recovery, and reimagine. And it really felt like the early phase of this fund was really about how to respond quickly, and then how to make sure that we were, really pushing for an equitable recovery and supporting partners in doing that. And now it feels like a really different moment when it's very important to also be investing in the reimagine. So one of my biggest takeaways from this past year in our work together is that the need for cash relief is huge, and we could pour all of philanthropy into it, and we still wouldn't hit the bottom. We need a systems approach. And so every time there's a crisis or a downturn, the country remembers how lacking our benefit system is, especially unemployment insurance, as you talked about, Rachel. So this is the moment to dig in and transform these systems. And I believe we have a few years to potentially remake the way our government and country supports people when they lose their jobs. And I think philanthropy is one key player in this. It's going to require us all coming to the table with serious resources and our different sets of expertise and networks. So much of what Adalys, what you were talking about around the networks you bring and the networks that JPB bring, and then of course all the other partners bring these enormous networks that really give us a chance to really help reimagine these systems to better benefit society as a whole, and especially those most vulnerable.
Thank you all. I want to really open up now and encourage people to jump into the chat. The question is, what do you see as priorities for the economic recovery, and where would you really want to see philanthropy show up as a partner in more meaningful ways? And thank you to folks who are already beginning to respond there. So we have from Marcy Goldstein-Gelb from National Kosh, which is a grantee of the fund. More than ever, workers need to be able to assert their right to be safe, to family-sustaining jobs and other benefits by demanding a seat at the table. Sometimes funders are interested in specific policy wins versus these more lengthy, long-term worker engagement processes. How do you balance the importance of specific policy wins with having this long-term horizon around worker engagement? That's question one. And then we've got a question from Eva Taylor. Opinions on multi-year funding to help nonprofits get back to pre-COVID levels of contributed income to serve their communities. So any thoughts on the importance of multi-year funding and the role philanthropy can play in really shoring up the financial sustainability of nonprofits in this moment? I'm going to invite our speakers to comment on either of these questions. Would anyone like to start?
I can start on the multi-year funding. So most of our strategic grants are multi-year commitments. So I think that's sort of typically how we would engage a partnership, knowing that it's going to be long-term. For our shorter-term partnerships, we really try to just be as flexible as possible to, move up funding, making sure that we were trying to help the nonprofits as quickly as possible, especially, last year when things were getting started. And I think going forward, we will continue to do that. I think that for us, the developing the partnership, knowing because we're really focused on the direct relief and knowing what the programs are doing, I think that seeing year over year how the funding is being used, whether the nonprofits are meeting the goals is very important. I think it's just part of sort of ingrained in the way that we do our grant making, and that will continue. And we'll just really have to be really flexible with nonprofits, knowing that they're going through a lot. A lot of them, had to lay off staff or had to furlough staff, or working with less volunteers, for example, at some of our food bank partners, which we really rely on in terms of engagement as well. So I think for us as funders, we just want to be as flexible as possible and definitely continue to focus on those multi-year partnerships.
Betsy, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with that. At least the multi-year funding is particularly important. That's been JPB's sort of default to do multi-year sort of large grants to organizations. And while we don't always or even often call them general operating support grants, they tend to be very flexible grants so that, again, we're always trying to meet the needs of the organization and their goals as well, which goes in some way to the question about when funders have sort of specific policy goals. That hasn't really been our approach so much as listening to what the organizations are wanting to do and need to, whether it is, to a big goal like ending evictions or, decreasing poverty, but really looking at how we're building power also. And so we fund a lot of community organizing networks as well as research and litigation and other sort of strategies. But I think like everybody in the past year, we've been looking really at the organizing groups and who we're funding and increasing our support for Black-led organizing in particular. And so I think that there's, it's sort of a weaving together of a number of different strands of work in this way.
Yeah, and I'm happy to I echo everything that Betsy and Adalys have said. We also at Ford do multi-year funding, general support, as flexible as we can be. And actually at the start of this crisis, the foundation made a really strong commitment to supporting the sustainability of organizations that we need now to be pushing forward their bold vision for the kinds of solutions that we need. And so at Ford, we essentially created a social bond program that was all about flexible, important resources to key organizations to really help see them through this really financial insecurity that many organizations are experiencing right now, many grantee partners are experiencing. And I couldn't agree more with the importance of listening to our grantee partners and really understanding where the real needs are, both for their core capacities, but also the needs of where and how groups are now partnering and coming together and creating more collective spaces to really move ideas forward. And that's something we've also been paying a lot of attention to, that again is about multi-year general support as well. But I'm going to speak to, I think it was Marcy's question about health and safety. And actually, I'm so proud of what the fund has been able to do in this context. I mean, health and safety is a great example of where there hasn't been as much philanthropic investments in this area. And then boom, this pandemic hits. And we all hear the horror stories of what's happening to so many workers in the lack of health and safety protections. And so our ability to quickly partner with KOSH and many other groups around the country who are working on health and safety issues, some of the grantees who are actually named, Betsy, that you were naming as you were talking about direct relief, like Endelon and many other groups, they were all key actors in how we think about solving for the real health and safety issues. And so the way that I think we think about policy at Ford is, it's not just about winning the policy, it's also about the implementation of the policy. And then it's really about the enforcement of those policies. And all through that cycle, the importance of ensuring that workers are a part of every step of that process. So they're shaping the policies, they're designing the implementation, and they are a part of leading how what enforcement of those policies can look like, especially in the case of health and safety in their workplaces. So for us, we see it as very important. This was a moment to address a really immediate need, but understand that it's part of a much longer engagement around how ultimately workers are able long-term to be able to shape the realities of their workplace policies, our broader government policies, let alone economic models that are influencing their lives. How they can shape those decisions is really the weaving that I think we're trying to do at Ford, but certainly through the fund, as you think about, again, the sort of response to recovery and then recovery to reimagine, we are also trying to weave that understanding of long-term, we want vulnerable communities and workers to be in positions where they can shape their futures.
This is great. And I'll just say on some of our workplace health and safety work with the Families and Workers Fund, one of the things that we learned is the fact that many workers struggled to communicate or were blocked rather in being able to really communicate what was necessary to creating a safe and healthy workplace early in the pandemic was actually likely a source of major community spread and was one of the factors that led to such uncontrolled spread, certainly in the beginning. We don't have great data on it in the US, but We know from colleagues who are working on similar issues in Asia that workplace spread accounted for about half of the community spread in a number of Asian countries in the beginning of the pandemic. So it's a real challenge, and it's something that I think we often think there are only technical solutions for, like masking and plexiglass, and that's part of it. But the work that Marcy at Kosh and others have led really shows that this is actually about worker voice and partnership between corporate leadership and frontline workers. And we've seen some really exciting, great initial examples of that. The chat has so many amazing questions and ideas coming through. So I am going to call out just two more. Nicole Keenan asked a question around regional work. There's been a big focus by Philanthropy, especially with this moment of transition in Washington, D.C. on federal approaches, but how are you thinking about regional and local work? And then a really great comment and question from Sam Spiewak. I'm talking about young people, the importance of a new deal for youth. I will throw in a stat here that I know haunts me very much from some of the research we've been doing with the fund, which is looking at the latest unemployment data. Black women under age 24 have unemployment rates of over 20% in many cases, whereas middle-aged white men have unemployment rates of 5 or 6%. So one is essentially living in a profound economic crisis, and another group is living in essentially a full employment kind of economy. So, can we take ownership that many of our recovery policies to date have really not served youth, in particular BIPOC youth? And what does it look like to center youth in the recovery moving forward? So who would like to start? I would be happy to pick on you again, Annalise.
I can start a little bit on the regional question. So I can't speak too much to, the advocacy per se, but from a grant making perspective, when we look at funding organizations, we're looking at mostly national organizations that have, legs on the ground in multiple places across the US. And that's really because we really try to engage our employees around our philanthropy. So even during COVID, as we look to make new grants or continue these long-term partnerships that we have, I think Feeding America is a great example of that. It's like we are funding this national organization, and they're a wonderful organization to work with, but we are definitely directing a lot of that funding to different food banks, and we want to make sure that we're doing it, equitably. We also look to see where the food banks are located, that they're close enough to some Morgan Stanley offices so that we're able to engage employees. So even though we're not volunteering right now because of COVID, we know that going forward, we want to maintain those relationships, and these partnerships help us do that.
Thank you. Betsy.
I can add something around the youth piece, and I'm not remembering if our fund made any youth-specific grants, but I know at JPB, like Ford, we fund a lot of democracy work and civic engagement by young people in particular. So in the past few years, we've funded a lot of the kind of youth engagement work, which I think in part led to the big youth turnout in the last elections. But we've also been looking at how to really involve young people past that in our economy better. And so we've, with Ford, actually have been hosting some conversations around youth engagement and environmental justice, and trying to really figure out new ways to fund some of the work that's happening with the amazing young people who are leading us to a better future, including around the Green New Deal, but in other ways also to, across issues. So I think that's a really promising area to focus on.
Yeah, then I would just add in, this is what excites me about the new strategies or the pivots we're making as a fund. I do think that the work, the investments we're going to make and the work we're going to do around, unemployment insurance and reimagining our systems, as well as the Recover Up, absolutely are huge opportunities for us to bring a youth perspective and what's really happening for young people. At Ford, we've been a part of a broader collaboration, which Rachel can certainly speak to more about, like what's the new deal for young people in this country, and being able to draw from some of that work to really inform how we think about the Recover Up strategy, and our strategy around unemployment insurance will be huge. I mean, through all of it, I think the through line is equity, and I think the fund has really held true to that. And that takes me to the regional and local work. I think we've been really cognizant that we don't want, and I think Annalise, you said this so well, we don't want to just fund things that are in New York, for example. Not that there isn't great need in New York, but we know that there are geographies across the country that are being hit differently and profoundly differently by this pandemic and this economic crisis. And so, I think the fund has been really learning and thinking through what are ways we can think about geographic priorities. How might we build partnerships with regional funders and local funders so that resourcing we might do in regions or local communities could be leveraged to actually have more resources in the region. So I think in this next phase of the fund, I'm excited about the potential for us to really catalyze some of that kind of partnership between local regional funding and what this fund is aiming to do overall.
This is great. I am going to pull one more question from the chat, and then we'll move towards closing. So there's a question around sharing research and data. I think at times it can feel like, everyone is in their own corner funding a different set of research or analysis. What does it look like for philanthropy actually to, have that information shared and to really pool it so that we're all working in the same direction? Annalise, I'm thinking of turning to you again, because Morgan Stanley also has an amazing in-house think tank and access to a lot of interesting data.
There's a lot of pressure, Rachel. It is not, obviously it's not my area of expertise, but we do have, very strong research division that has been leading in COVID research specifically. So I think, when we think about the resources that a corporation can pull together, we know that that's something that we always think about. So even though as a grant maker, this is not something that I can contribute or be a part of, we do have the resources of the firm that we're able to share.
Really good question. I mean, we fund a lot of research, and I don't think we at JPB or generally foundations do enough to figure out how to get that research out there also. So I know we just made a grant to the Russell Sage Foundation for their research on the economic, social, and political impacts of COVID-19. And, I'd love to work with others to figure out when those 40 researchers, come back with their work, what are we going to do with that? How is that going to, we always try to make research grants that really connect to action on the ground, but there's always more work to be done there. So, for example, the eviction lab, which we helped, launch when it was first starting with funding, I think that research has been used by a lot of people on the ground, but again, there's always more to do.
I would just add to that. I mean, this goes back to why collaborations like this are so important, because bringing a diverse set of funders together who have really different assets that they can bring to the table. And so Morgan Stanley's research and data, I'm thinking about Schmidt Futures, who's another partner who is able to bring forward some really helpful research and data for all of us around the table to share and analyze the data together. I think we just scratched the surface of it in this first year or almost year of the fund. And I think, again, the opportunities with the Recover Up work and the unemployment insurance work that we'll be doing together is another space for us to continue to build that muscle together. And Betsy, you're totally right. Many of us are funding fabulous research and data institutions that we could really cull that data together in more thoughtful ways that benefit our own analysis, but more importantly, are really connecting the dots and supporting grantee partners to have more impact. So I'm excited for what that is, what we can do together, but that again speaks to why the diversity of the funders around the table are so key, as well as understanding that it's going to take a lot of different strategies to really meet this moment, and our ability to invest in ways that really strengthen all of those strategies will be key.
That's great.
I know that during our planning for the year, we talked a little bit about communication and what that looks like going forward. I think that part of it, is not necessarily data driven, but telling the story of the fund and who we're helping, I think is really important. We focus a lot on workers, but that we should also focus a lot on the families and how supporting workers really is supporting kids and supporting families. I think that's going to be really important for us going forward.
I really appreciate that. And while we're in this conversation about research, I also wanted to share something we've been talking about a lot on the fund, which is also the limits of research and the way that actually, really brilliantly done and organized research has failed us sometimes, has not been enough to kind of get some of the changes that we need for this recovery. So in particular, I think we all became very clear in really getting into the data of how pervasive unemployment and underemployment was and who was impacted, that expansion of benefits in some way that can include stimulus checks, that can include unemployment insurance, other mechanisms, but that was really critical. And we saw that consensus among economists across the ideological spectrum. We saw, the research that really said the danger is in doing too little here so that families are struggling. So child poverty spikes, which it has, versus doing too much and people misusing it, which was the narrative that was out there. And despite that really strong research consensus around the urgency of getting more cash to people, a number of these key programs, especially around unemployment insurance, expired at the end of last year, and there was a gap that people faced. And I think for philanthropy, that was in some ways a wake-up call around the limits of research and how powerful narratives are, because the narrative that was blocking all this research and clarity from turning into bold action were narratives of the undeserving poor and welfare queens, and narratives that have deeply, racist, sexist, classist roots in our society, and don't come from any one place. They come from so many different sources in our culture. So as we look to our grant making moving forward, the policy and the research matters, and the implementation and delivery matters, but I think we also are clear more now than ever that these narratives matter, that these narratives can actually really constrain what is possible. So a final question to wrap us up. Adelise, I will not start with you. So
it's okay.
The final question is, what do you see as the call to action for philanthropy this year as we think through these profoundly unequal impacts of the pandemic and the economic downturn on workers and on families? And I will start with you, Betsy.
Well, I think a lot of philanthropy and organizations kind of stepped up in a big way last year, and now is not the time to step down. I think we have to sort of keep pushing forward with our supporting the groups that are on the front lines and doing the work, both at the direct relief level and also at the systemic change level. So I think the needs are going to continue for direct relief also, around hunger and rollout of the vaccine and healthcare, and Wi-Fi, childcare continues to be a huge issue for people. So all of those things are going to require both a direct and a systemic response. And I think what this fund is also reminding me is that there are going to be more crises, whether they're pandemic related or climate related this year, or democracy crises that we've seen. I can imagine more coming, that this kind of fund, a rapid response, sort of collaborative response, is really useful, and we should be continuing to keep our learnings from it in mind as we prepare to respond to other crises.
Annalise, I'll go over to you next. What's the call to action?
I agree with everything Betsy said. I think it's about digging deep, really focusing on our grantees and their needs and how we better support our communities. I think that's going to be the most important thing.
And Sarita.
Yeah, I think for me, what comes to mind is surge. We're asking our grantees to surge and work in new ways to meet the moment, and we need to do the same. And in my mind, that means two things. It means we need to get resources out the door. This is not a moment, as Betsy said, to sit back and to analyze the moment, but to actually resource the ideas and the institutions. And it's also a moment for us to work in new ways as philanthropy, and especially to be more collaborative with each other and with frontline leaders. I think that's the other really key thing that is a big learning for many of us through this fund is the magic that is possible, the ideas that are possible when we as philanthropy don't just talk amongst ourselves and our grantee partners are talking amongst themselves, but together we're talking about where the needs are and what the opportunities are. So let's surge, let's stretch, let's really meet this moment.
That is an awesome note to end on. Let's surge and let's stretch. So thank you all so much. This has been a really great conversation. And thanks to everyone who joined. The comments and ideas and questions in the chat were awesome. We will definitely take them back. And I will be sure right now as we close to just drop some links into the chat to some of the ideas that came up, the organizations that were referenced, grantee partners. So thank you so much. I hope that you all stay safe and healthy. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.